was 17 years old when she learned that some people will try to break you just because they can, not because you did something wrong, not because you hurt them, but simply because your existence makes them uncomfortable. She was a senior at Westbrook High, a school known for its shiny hallways, expensive sports programs, and parents who drove cars that cost more than most people's homes. Didn't belong there. Everyone knew it. She knew it too, but she showed up every single day anyway because that's what her grandmother had taught her to do. You walk into every room like you deserve to be there, her grandmother used to say, because you do. His grandmother had passed away 2 years ago, but her words still echoed in his mind every morning when she got dressed for school. Every morning when she waited for the bus, while other kids drove past in their parents' luxury cars. Every morning when she walked through those front doors and pretended not to notice the looks. The thing about being poor in a rich school is that people don't need to say anything. They just look at you a certain way. They look at your shoes. They look at your backpack. They look at the lunch you brought from home while they're ordering delivery from expensive restaurants. And in those looks, you see everything they're thinking. Had gotten good at ignoring it. 3 years of practice will do that to a person. She was at Westbrook on a scholarship. A full academic scholarship that covered tuition but nothing else. Not the fancy uniforms everyone else wore. Not the field trips that cost hundreds of dollars. Not the laptop that every student was expected to have. Made do with second-hand clothes, skipped the trips, and used the old computers in the library during lunch while other kids ate together in the cafeteria. She didn't mind being alone. Honestly, she preferred it. Being alone meant no one asking questions about where she lived, no one wanting to come over to her apartment, no one seeing her mother working double shifts at the hospital just to keep the lights on. But there was one thing couldn't hide, one thing that lived inside her so deeply that sometimes she felt like it might burst out of her chest. Music. Had been playing piano since she was 4 years old. Her grandmother had started teaching her on an old keyboard that was missing 3 keys. They couldn't afford lessons, couldn't afford a real piano, couldn't afford any of the things that other kids had. But her grandmother had something those things could never buy. She had talent, real talent, the kind that comes along once in a generation. His grandmother had grown up in China during a time of great hardship. Her family had nothing, but somehow her parents had scraped together enough money to give her piano lessons. She turned out to be extraordinary. By the time she was 20, she had performed in concert halls across Asia. Critics called her a prodigy. They said she played with the kind of emotion that made audiences weep. Then war came. Then poverty came. Then she had to leave everything behind and come to America with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of music that had nowhere to go. She worked in factories. She cleaned houses. She raised a daughter alone after her husband died young. And when that daughter had a daughter of her own, she finally had someone to pass her gift to. From the moment touched those broken keyboard keys, her grandmother knew. She knew that everything she had lost, everything she had sacrificed, everything she had carried across oceans and through decades of struggle, it had all been for this. For this little girl with small fingers and big eyes who listened to music like she was hearing the voice of God. You have it, her grandmother whispered that first day. You have the gift. For 13 years, his grandmother taught her everything. They practiced on that broken keyboard until they saved enough for a used upright piano from a church that was closing down. It was out of tune and the wood was scratched, but too, it was the most beautiful thing in the world. Her grandmother taught her technique, but more than that, she taught her feeling. Anyone can learn to hit the right notes, she would say, but not everyone can make people feel something. That's what separates players from artists. When her grandmother got sick, they kept practicing. Even when she was too weak to demonstrate, she would sit beside and listen, her eyes closed, a small smile on her face. Sometimes tears would roll down her cheeks. Happy tears, she always said. Proud tears. She died on a Tuesday afternoon in spring, was 15. She held her grandmother's hand as she took her last breath, and something inside went quiet. For 6 months, she couldn't touch the piano. Every time she looked at it, she saw her grandmother sitting there, and the pain was too much. But eventually, the music called her back. It always does for people who truly have it in their souls. And when finally sat down and played again, she understood something important. Her grandmother wasn't gone. She was in every note, every chord, every melody that flowed from fingers carried her grandmother's spirit with it. Now, at Westbrook High, no one knew any of this. To them was just the quiet scholarship girl who sat in the back and never talked to anyone. They didn't know about the piano in her tiny apartment. They didn't know about the hours she spent practicing every night after finishing her homework. They didn't know that she had mastered pieces that most professional pianists struggled with. And liked it that way. Music was her secret, her sanctuary, the one place where she wasn't poor or invisible or different. When she played, she was exactly who she was meant to be. But secrets have a way of coming out, and was about to come out in a way she never expected. It started with a flyer on the bulletin board outside the main office. Spring Showcase auditions, it said. All students welcome. Had walked past that board 100 times without stopping. The showcase was for the music department kids, the ones who took private lessons that cost more per hour than some mother made in a day, the ones who had been groomed for performances since birth. It wasn't for people like her. But something made her stop that day. Maybe it was the anniversary of her grandmother's death coming up. Maybe it was the loneliness that had been growing heavier lately. Maybe it was her grandmother's voice in her head, telling her she deserved to be in any room she wanted. Whatever it was, found herself writing her name at the bottom of the sheet. Her hand was shaking. Her heart was pounding. A voice in her head screamed at her to cross it out, to walk away, to stay invisible where it was safe. But she didn't. She wrote her name, and she walked away before she could change her mind. Had no idea that this small act, 12 letters on a piece of paper, was about to change everything. She didn't know that someone was watching her sign up, someone who had already decided that didn't belong at Westbrook High, someone who was about to make it their mission to prove it in front of everyone. The music teacher, Mrs. Vance, had seen the whole thing, and she was not happy about it, not happy at all. Mrs. Vance had been the music teacher at Westbrook High for 22 years. In that time, she had built a reputation, not for being kind, not for being inspiring, but for being selective. She believed that music was a privilege, not a right, and in her mind, that privilege belonged to a certain type of student. The type whose parents donated to the school, the type who had been taking lessons since they could walk, the type who came from the right families, wore the right clothes, and understood that the world was built for people like them. Was not that type. When Mrs. Vance saw his name on the sheet, she actually laughed. It was a short, sharp sound that made the office secretary look up from her computer. Mrs. Vance didn't explain. She just shook her head and walked away, already planning how she would handle this little situation. The next morning, Mrs. Vance mentioned the auditions during her advanced music class. This was her favorite class, filled with her favorite students. Kids whose parents paid for private lessons with renowned instructors. Kids who had performed at recitals since elementary school. Kids who would look very impressive on the showcase stage. "I should warn you all," Mrs. Vance said, leaning against her desk with a small smile. "We have some unexpected names on the audition list this year. It seems some students don't understand what the showcase is really about." A few students exchanged glances. They knew exactly what she meant. "Of course, we have to let everyone audition. Rules are rules, but I'm sure the cream will rise to the top as it always does." The message was clear. The auditions were just a formality. Mrs. Vance had already decided who would perform. She always did. Word spread quickly through the school, as word always does. By lunchtime, Everyone knew that the quiet scholarship girl had signed up for the spring showcase. The reactions ranged from confusion to amusement to outright mockery. Does she even know what a piano is? One girl asked loudly in the cafeteria, making sure could hear from her usual spot in the corner. Maybe she'll play Hot Cross Buns, another replied. That's probably the only song poor people know. Laughter erupted around them, kept her eyes on her book and pretended to read. Her face was burning, but she had learned a long time ago not to react. Reacting only made things worse. Reacting showed them they had power over you. But inside, doubt was creeping in. What had she been thinking? Why had she signed up? She didn't belong on that stage. She didn't belong anywhere near it. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, but for the first time, it wasn't enough to quiet the fear. That night, sat at her piano for 3 hours without playing a single note. She just stared at the keys, remembering her grandmother's hands moving across them. Those hands that had known so much hardship but still created such beauty. Those hands that had held hers and guided her fingers when she was just a little girl. "What would you do?" whispered to the empty room. "Would you tell me to go, or would you tell me to stay safe?" The room stayed silent, but somewhere deep in her heart already knew the answer. Her grandmother had never chosen safe, not once in her entire life. She had chosen brave again and again, even when it cost her everything. Took a deep breath and began to play. The day of the auditions arrived faster than expected. She woke up that morning with a knot in her stomach that wouldn't go away. She put on her nicest clothes, which weren't very nice at all. A simple dark dress she had found at a thrift store and a cardigan her mother had given her for her birthday. She looked at herself in the mirror and tried to see what her grandmother would see. A fighter, a survivor, a girl with music in her soul. But all she could see was someone who was about to make a fool of herself. The auditions were held in the school auditorium after classes ended. When walked in, there were already about 40 students there. Most of them were from the music program. They sat in clusters, chatting and laughing, completely confident in their right to be there. A few of them glanced at when she entered. Some whispered. Some pointed. Most just looked away as if she wasn't worth their attention. Found a seat in the back row and sat down alone. She folded her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking. The auditions went in alphabetical order. Student after student took the stage, performing pieces on various instruments: violin, cello, flute, voice, and of course piano. The music department students were good, really good. They had clearly been preparing for weeks, maybe months. Their performances were polished and precise. But something was missing, couldn't quite name it. They hit all the right notes, followed all the right rhythms, but the music didn't seem to breathe. It was like watching someone recite a poem they had memorized without understanding what the words meant. Still, Mrs. Vance applauded enthusiastically after each performance. She made notes on her clipboard and nodded approvingly. These were her students, her chosen ones. They would make her look good at the showcase. 2 hours passed, then 3. The auditorium was getting emptier as students finished and left. Finally, there was only one name remaining on the list. Yep. Mrs. Vance looked at her clipboard, then looked up at sitting alone in the back row. A smile spread across her face. It was not a kind smile. She called out, her voice echoing through the nearly empty auditorium. "It's your turn, if you still want to go through with this." The remaining students, about 15 of them, turned to watch. A few had their phones out. They were expecting entertainment, just not the kind was planning to give them. Stood up, her legs felt like they might give out beneath her, but she forced them to move. One step, then another. The walk from the back row to the stage felt like it took a lifetime. She could feel everyone's eyes on her. She could hear the whispers. When she reached the front, Mrs. Vance stepped into her path. The teacher looked her up and down, taking in the thrift store dress, the old cardigan, the worn shoes. "Miss," Mrs. Vance said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I want to make sure you understand what this audition is for. This is the spring showcase. Our most prestigious event of the year. Parents attend. School board members attend. Local media sometimes covers it." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Are you sure you're prepared for that level of performance?" His throat tightened. She wanted to turn around. She wanted to run. Every instinct told her this was a mistake. But then she thought of her grandmother. Her grandmother who had lost everything and still found a way to make music. Her grandmother who had walked into rooms where no one wanted her and refused to leave. Her grandmother who had poured every ounce of her soul into a little girl with small fingers and big dreams. "Yes," said quietly, "I'm sure." Mrs. Vance raised an eyebrow. "Really? And what exactly are you planning to play for us today?" "Chopsticks. Mary had a little lamb." A few students laughed. Someone was definitely recording now. Didn't answer. She simply walked past Mrs. Vance and climbed the steps to the stage. The grand piano sat there under the spotlights, gleaming and perfect. It was the most beautiful instrument had ever seen. Nothing like the old upright in her apartment with its scratched wood and sticky keys. She sat down on the bench and adjusted her position. Her hands were trembling. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Mrs. Vance called out from below, "We're waiting, miss. Some of us have better things to do." More laughter. Closed her eyes. She thought of her grandmother's hands. She thought of late nights practicing until her fingers ached. She thought of every person who had ever looked at her like she was nothing. Then she opened her eyes, placed her fingers on the keys, and began to play. The first note rang out like a bell in a silent church. It was a single tone, just one key pressed by one finger, but something about it made every person in that auditorium stop breathing. The whispers died. The snickers faded. Even Mrs. Vance, who had been checking her watch with obvious impatience, looked up with a confused expression on her face. That one note hung in the air for what felt like forever. It was pure. It was clear. It was the kind of sound that reaches into your chest and wraps itself around your heart. Then came the second note, and the third, and suddenly the melody began to unfold like a flower opening at dawn. Had chosen Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It was not a piece for beginners. It was not even a piece for intermediate players. It was a masterwork, nearly 12 minutes long, filled with technical passages that made professional pianists nervous. Music schools used it as a test piece because so few could play it well. Mrs. Vance knew this piece. She had heard it performed by her best students over the years. Most of them stumbled through it. Some gave up halfway. The ones who finished usually looked relieved just to have survived. But was not stumbling. She was not surviving. She was doing something else entirely. She was flying. Her fingers moved across the keys with a speed and precision that seemed almost impossible. But it wasn't the technical skill that made people stare. Plenty of students could hit the right notes at the right time. What made this different was the feeling behind it. Every phrase played told a story. The opening theme was soft and searching, like someone walking through fog, looking for something they had lost. Then it grew stronger, more urgent, like that person had caught a glimpse of what they were seeking and was running toward it. The music swelled and crashed and whispered and roared, and through it all, there was an emotion so raw and real that it was almost painful to hear. In the third row, a girl named felt tears forming in her eyes. She didn't know why. She had never cried at music before. She had always thought people who cried at concerts were being dramatic, but now she understood. This wasn't just sound. This was someone's soul being poured out through 88 keys. A boy near the back had been holding his phone up to record, planning to post a video mocking the scholarship girl, but his hand had slowly lowered to his lap. He had forgotten about the video. He had forgotten about everything. All he could do was listen. Mrs. Vance stood frozen at the foot of the stage. Her clipboard hung loosely at her side. Her carefully constructed expression of superiority had crumbled completely. In 22 years of teaching, she had never heard a student play like this. She had never heard anyone play like this. The music built toward its first climax. Hands flew across the keyboard, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. Her eyes were closed. She wasn't reading sheet music. She wasn't counting beats. She was somewhere else entirely, lost in a world that existed only between her and the piano. She was playing for her grandmother. In her mind could see the tiny apartment where she had grown up. She could see the old upright piano with its scratched wood. She could see her grandmother sitting beside her, eyes closed, that small smile on her face. She could hear her voice, gentle but firm. Feel the music, little one. Don't just play it, feel it. Let it move through you like water. Let it speak the things you cannot say with words. Had never really understood what that meant when she was younger. She had practiced and practiced, focusing on getting the notes right, making sure her timing was perfect. But somewhere along the way, something had shifted. The music had stopped being something she did and had become something she was. The middle section of the ballade was gentler, more reflective. The thundering passages gave way to a melody so tender and sad that it felt like a lullaby for a broken heart. This was the part loved most. This was where she always thought of her grandmother's hands, wrinkled and worn from years of hard work, but still so graceful on the keys. In the audience was openly crying now. She wasn't alone. 2 other students had tears streaming down their faces. Even some of the boys who had been ready to laugh looked shaken, like they had just witnessed something they couldn't explain. Mrs. Vance had not moved. She had not blinked. Her mind was racing, trying to process what she was seeing and hearing. This girl, this quiet, invisible girl who sat in the back of every class, this scholarship student she had dismissed without a second thought. How was this possible? Where had she come from? How had no one known? The music began to build again, climbing toward the final section of the piece. This was where lesser pianists often fell apart. The technical demands were brutal. The emotional intensity was even harder to maintain. Most performances ended with exhausted fingers stumbling through the finale. But was not exhausted. If anything, she seemed to be drawing strength from somewhere deep inside herself. Her playing grew more powerful, more passionate, more alive. The notes cascaded like waterfalls. The chords crashed like thunder. The melody soared higher and higher until it felt like the entire auditorium might lift off the ground. And then came the ending. Chopin wrote one of the most devastating conclusions in all of piano music. After all the beauty and the drama and the tenderness, the piece ends in a storm of grief. It is not a happy ending. It is not a triumphant ending. It is an ending that sounds like the world falling apart. Played it like she knew exactly what that felt like. The final chords rang out, each one more devastating than the last. Her hands moved with fierce determination, attacking the keys with everything she had. This was not gentle music. This was music that had teeth, music that bit and tore and refused to look away from pain. The very last note was a single bass tone, struck hard and left to fade into silence. His hands hovered above the keys for a moment. Then she slowly lowered them to her lap. She opened her eyes. The auditorium was completely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. No one even seemed to breathe. The silence stretched on for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Felt her heart pounding. Had she made a mistake? Had she played something wrong? Why wasn't anyone saying anything? She looked out at the faces staring at her and couldn't read their expressions. Were they angry, confused, disappointed? Then stood up. She didn't say anything. She just rose to her feet and started clapping, slowly at first, then faster, then harder. The boy next to her stood up too, then the girl behind him, then 3 more students, then 5 more. Within seconds, every single person in that auditorium was on their feet, clapping and cheering and shouting. It wasn't polite applause. It wasn't the kind of clapping you do because you're supposed to. It was the kind of reaction that comes from somewhere primal, somewhere beyond thought. It was the sound of people who had just experienced something that changed them. sat at the piano, overwhelmed. She didn't know what to do. She had never performed for anyone except her grandmother. She had never heard applause like this. She had never seen people looking at her like she mattered. Through the chaos of noise and movement, his eyes found Mrs. Vance. The teacher was still standing at the foot of the stage. She was not clapping. She was not cheering. She was just staring at with an expression that was impossible to read. Their eyes met, and in that moment something passed between them, something unspoken but understood. Mrs. Vance had tried to break her, and she had failed. But the story wasn't over yet, because what happened next would prove that sometimes the hardest part isn't the performance, it's what comes after. The applause lasted for nearly 2 full minutes, lost track of time. She sat at the piano bench, hands folded in her lap, not knowing whether to stand or stay or run away. No one had ever clapped for her before. Not like this. Not with tears in their eyes and wonder on their faces. Finally, the noise began to fade. Students sat back down, wiping their cheeks, exchanging glances that said they couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. The auditorium felt different now. The air itself seemed changed, like a storm had passed through and left everything cleaner. Stood up slowly. Her legs were shaking. The adrenaline that had carried her through the performance was draining away, leaving her feeling hollow and exhausted. She walked toward the steps at the side of the stage, her eyes fixed on the floor. She had almost reached the stairs when Mrs. Vance's voice cut through the silence. "Miss, wait." Stopped. She turned around to face the teacher who had tried so hard to humiliate her. Mrs. Vance was walking toward the stage, her heels clicking against the floor with each step. Her face was unreadable. Her clipboard was nowhere to be seen. The remaining students watched in tense silence. They could feel that something important was about to happen, something that would determine what this moment actually meant. Mrs. Vance stopped at the foot of the stage and looked up at. For a long moment, she didn't speak. She just stared, like she was seeing for the first time, like she was trying to figure out how she had missed something so obvious. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Mrs. Vance finally asked. Her voice was quieter than before. The sharp edge was gone. Swallowed hard. "My grandmother taught me." "Your grandmother?" Mrs. Vance repeated the word slowly. "And who is your grandmother? What conservatory did she attend? Who were her teachers?" "She didn't go to a conservatory," said. "She learned in China, before she came to America, before she lost everything." Something flickered across Mrs. Vance's face. It might have been surprise. It might have been shame. It was hard to tell. "She taught you that piece, the entire Chopin Ballade." "She taught me everything," said simply. "She's the reason I play." Mrs. Vance opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a voice came from the audience. "That was incredible." Everyone turned, was standing up again, her face still streaked with tears. She was looking at with something like awe. "I've been taking lessons for 12 years, continued. "I've heard professional recordings of that piece, and I've never heard anyone play it like you just did. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard in my life." Other students started nodding. A boy in the back raised his hand like he was in class. "How are you not in the music program? How did nobody know about you?" The questions opened a floodgate. Suddenly, everyone was talking at once. "How long have you been playing? Who else have you studied with? Are you going to audition for music schools? Why have you been hiding this?" Didn't know how to answer. She had spent 3 years being invisible at this school, 3 years being looked through and talked about and dismissed. Now suddenly everyone wanted to know her story. It was overwhelming. Mrs. Vance raised her hand and the students fell silent. The teacher's authority still held weight, even after what had just happened. "Everyone please give Miss some space." She turned back to, "I think we need to talk, privately. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning before classes?" It wasn't really a question. Nodded. "Good." Mrs. Vance picked up her clipboard from where she had dropped it earlier. She looked at it for a moment, then looked back at. For what it's worth, that was a remarkable performance, truly remarkable. Then she turned and walked out of the auditorium without another word. Finally climbed down from the stage. She was immediately surrounded by students who wanted to talk to her, congratulate her, ask her questions. It was too much, too fast, too different from everything she had known. She mumbled something about needing to catch her bus and pushed through the crowd toward the exit. Her hands were still trembling. Her heart was still racing. She needed air. She needed quiet. She needed to process what had just happened. Outside, the sun was setting. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the air was cool against her flushed cheeks. Walked to the bus stop and sat down on the bench, staring at nothing. She had done it. She had actually done it. She had walked onto that stage, faced down everyone who expected her to fail, and she had played her grandmother's music for them. And they had heard it, really heard it. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Then again. Then again. She pulled it out and saw notifications flooding her screen, text messages from numbers she didn't recognize, social media alerts from accounts she barely used. Someone had posted a video. Stomach dropped. She opened the first link with shaking fingers. There it was, a video titled "Scholarship Girl Shocks Everyone at Piano Audition." It had been posted less than an hour ago. It already had 10,000 views. She pressed play and watched herself walk to the stage. She heard Mrs. Vance's cruel comments about her clothes, about her background. She saw herself sit down at the piano. She heard that first note ring out. And she watched the faces in the audience change. The comments section was exploding. People were sharing the video everywhere. Some comments were about her playing. Some were about Mrs. Vance's behavior. Some were from people claiming to be musicians, analyzing her technique, expressing disbelief that a high school student could play at that level. By the time bus arrived, the video had 50,000 views. By the time she got home, it had 200,000. Her mother was working a night shift at the hospital, so the apartment was empty. Sat down at her old upright piano, the one with the scratched wood and the sticky keys. She placed her hands on the keyboard but didn't play. She just sat there, thinking about how strange life could be. This morning she had been nobody, the quiet girl, the scholarship kid, the one people looked through like she was made of glass. Tonight, hundreds of thousands of people were watching her play Chopin. She thought about her grandmother. What would she think of all this? Would she be proud? Would she be worried? Would she tell to enjoy the moment or warn her that attention like this always comes with a price? His phone rang. She looked at the screen. It was a number she didn't recognize with an area code from New York City. She let it go to voicemail. It rang again. A different number, then again, then again. She turned the phone off. Tomorrow she would deal with all of this. Tomorrow she would go to Mrs. Vance's office and find out what the teacher wanted to say. Tomorrow she would face the students who now knew her secret. Tomorrow she would figure out what came next. But tonight she just wanted to be alone with her piano and her memories. She closed her eyes, placed her fingers on the keys, and began to play. Not Chopin this time, something simpler, a melody her grandmother used to hum while cooking dinner, a tune from the old country carried across oceans and through generations. The notes filled the small apartment like warm light, and somewhere new, her grandmother was listening. The video hit 1 million views by midnight. By morning, everything would be different. News outlets would be calling. Music schools would be reaching out. Strangers would be arguing about her in comment sections around the world. But didn't know any of that yet. She just played her grandmother's song and let the music carry her through the night. She had no idea that the hardest choice of her life was waiting for her in Mrs. Vance's office. A choice that would test everything she believed about music, about success, and about what it really means to honor the people who made us who we are. Arrived at school the next morning to find the world had shifted beneath her feet. Students who had never looked at her before were now staring. Some smiled. Some whispered. Some held up their phones and pointed, like she was a celebrity walking down a red carpet instead of a teenager walking into high school. The video had exploded overnight, 3 million views by sunrise. News stations had picked up the story. Headlines were everywhere. Bullied student stuns school with piano performance. Teacher tries to shame scholarship girl, gets lesson instead. Hidden prodigy goes viral after emotional audition. Kept her head down and walked straight to Mrs. Vance's office. The door was open. Mrs. Vance was sitting behind her desk, looking tired. There were dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept. When she saw in the doorway, she gestured to the chair across from her. "Close the door, please." Did as she was told and sat down. Her heart was pounding, but she kept her face calm. She had survived worse than this. She could survive whatever came next. For a long moment, Mrs. Vance didn't speak. She just looked at with an expression that was hard to read. Finally, she let out a long breath. "I owe you an apology." Blinked. Of all the things she had expected to hear, that wasn't one of them. "What I said to you yesterday in front of everyone was cruel and unprofessional. I made assumptions about you based on things that had nothing to do with your talent or your character. I was wrong." Mrs. Vance paused. "I've been wrong about a lot of things, it seems." Didn't know what to say. She had imagined this conversation 100 times on her way to school. She had prepared herself for anger, for excuses, for blame. She had not prepared for this. "The video," Mrs. Vance continued. "I've seen it. I've read the comments. I've watched myself say those things to you, and I'm ashamed. I've spent 22 years teaching at this school, and somewhere along the way, I forgot why I started teaching in the first place. I forgot that music doesn't care about money or status or where you come from. Music just cares about truth." She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out an envelope. She slid it across the desk toward. "This came for you this morning. Hand delivered. There are more in my inbox, but this one seemed the most important." Picked up the envelope. The return address said Conservatory, one of the most prestigious music schools in the country. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a letter, a full scholarship offer. 4 years of tuition, room and board, private instruction with world-renowned teachers. Everything paid for. All she had to do was say yes. Read the letter twice. Then she set it down on the desk and looked at Mrs. Vance. "There are others?" she asked quietly. 7 so far, more coming, I'm sure. Your video has been seen by over 5 million people now. Everyone wants to know who you are. Everyone wants to claim they discovered you." Mrs. Vance's voice was tired but honest. "You're going to have a lot of choices to make. A lot of people are going to want things from you." Looked at the letter again. Conservatory. It was everything her grandmother had never had, every opportunity that had been stolen from her by war and poverty and circumstance. Could have it all now. She could become the pianist her grandmother had always dreamed of being. But something felt wrong. "Can I ask you something?" said. Mrs. Vance nodded. "Why did you become a music teacher?" The question seemed to catch Mrs. Vance off guard. She sat back in her chair and thought for a moment. "Because I loved music," she said finally. "Because when I was young, music saved me. I grew up in a house with a lot of anger, a lot of pain. The piano was the only place I felt safe, the only place I felt like myself." She looked down at her hands. "I wanted to give that to other people. I wanted to help young musicians find what I found." "What happened?" Mrs. Vance smiled sadly. "Life happened. Politics happened. Parents who wanted their children to succeed at any cost. Administrators who cared more about reputation than education. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing students as people with dreams. I started seeing them as problems to manage or prizes to collect." She met's eyes. "I stopped listening for the music. And when you can't hear the music anymore, you're not really a teacher. You're just someone standing in front of a classroom." The room fell silent. Understood more than Mrs. Vance probably realized. She understood what it felt like to lose something essential. She understood what it felt like to find it again. "I'm going to perform at the showcase," said. It wasn't a question. Mrs. Vance nodded. "Of course, you've more than earned it. And I want to play something different, not the chop-in." Mrs. Vance raised an eyebrow. "What did you have in mind?" Thought about her grandmother, about the songs she had carried across oceans, about the melodies that had survived wars and losses and decades of silence, about the music that had been passed down like a sacred inheritance from one generation to the next. "Something my grandmother taught me," said. "Something from her homeland. Most people have never heard it, but it's the most beautiful piece I know." Mrs. Vance studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. "I think that sounds perfect." The night of the spring showcase arrived 3 weeks later. The auditorium was packed. Every seat was filled. News cameras lined the back wall. People had come from all over the state to see the girl from the viral video. Waited backstage, wearing a dress her mother had saved for months to buy. It was simple but elegant, deep blue like the ocean at twilight. Her mother was in the audience, sitting in the front row for the first time ever. She had taken the night off work, something she almost never did. The other performers went first. They played beautifully. The audience clapped politely, but everyone knew what they were really waiting for. Finally, the announcer called her name. Walked onto the stage. The lights were blinding. The crowd was enormous. She could feel millions of eyes on her, both in the room and watching through screens around the world. She sat down at the grand piano. She adjusted the bench. She placed her hands on the keys. And then she did something unexpected. She spoke. "Before I play," she said into the microphone, her voice steady despite her pounding heart, "I want to tell you about someone. Her name was Hui. She was my grandmother. She grew up in China during a time of great suffering. She lost her home, her family, her country. She came to America with nothing except the music she carried in her heart." The audience was perfectly still. "She never got to play on a stage like this. She never got the chances I'm getting now. But every note I play belongs to her. She taught me that music isn't about being rich or famous or better than other people. Music is about truth. It's about taking the things we can't say with words and giving them a voice." Looked out at the sea of faces. Somewhere in the crowd, Mrs. Vance was watching. Somewhere, her mother was crying. This song is for her, and for everyone who was ever told they didn't belong. She turned to the piano and began to play. The melody was old, ancient even. It spoke of mountains shrouded in mist, of rivers that had flowed for thousands of years, of love and loss and the endless cycle of seasons. It was simple compared to Chopin, but in its simplicity there was something profound. When the last note faded, the silence lasted longer than before. Then the applause began, not just clapping this time. People were standing, people were crying, people were holding onto each other like they had just witnessed something holy. Stood and bowed. She looked at her mother, who was sobbing with pride. She looked at Mrs. Vance, who was clapping harder than anyone. And in her heart, she heard her grandmother's voice one last time. "You did it, little one. You made them hear the music." Smiled through her tears. She had done more than survive. She had made sure that her grandmother's song would never be forgotten. And in the end, that mattered more than any scholarship or any headline or any viral video. Some people are born to be seen. Others simply wait for the right moment to be heard. Had found her moment, and the music would live on forever.